devastated by the pandemic. Suddenly, groups of people exhaling together in close proximity seem dangerous. According to Silvia Grana of the European Choral Association Europa Cantat, or ECAEC, an umbrella group for choirs, rumours of super spreading at rehearsals were unfounded. In any event, they were suspended en masse, along with concerts and church services. All this is causing financial hardship for professional singers and heartbreak for amateurs. According to Chorus America, a networking group, 42.6 million Americans regularly sing in choirs. The country has almost 270,000 choruses, most of them religious. In Europe, an estimated 37 million people take part. In many places, choirs bring together individuals who have little in common besides a love of music. Researchers at Oxford University and at the universities of Oldenburg and Vienna have found that amateur choral singing helps establish bonds and boosts feelings of connectedness. In a recent survey by the ECAEC, virtually all respondents said their choirs had been affected by the virus. Some are able to rehearse online, but the social aspect, the main appeal for many singers, which now makes the activity seem risky, is harder to rate. The joy of making music with others, says Annie Sedley, who sings with the Royal Free Music Society Choir in North London, the excitement of the performance, all that has gone. Her choir meets for Zoom sessions, while its members dream of getting together again. The choir plays an important part at our church, says Charles Olson, who sings at North Park Covenant Church in Chicago, so this situation is devastating. Like other artists, meanwhile, professional singers, most of whom are freelancers, are struggling financially. There's just no work, laments Lawrence Wallington, a British bass who has sung with the choir of Westminster Abbey, among others. Mr. Wallington doesn't know when he will perform again. He is hoping that a concert scheduled for November will prove feasible. By then, he will have gone more than half a year without choral singing and without an income. Westminster Abbey's choir, which kept singing through the Second World War, is bound to survive the pandemic. Others will adapt to a new socially distanced reality. Justin Doyle, conductor of the Rias Chamber Choir in Berlin, suggests that disruption could be a spur to new formats. After the hiatus, his group's live performances may involve 3 teams of singers taking turns to deliver the same programme to small audiences. We can innovate more than football can, Mr. Doyle reckons. But without targeted financial support, many other ensembles may have to fold. The prospects of the highly regarded Vienna Boys Choir, among others, look bleak. For many enthusiasts, life after lockdown will be less melodious and lonelier. Books and arts. Book review. Thought-provoking fiction. Not Going Gently. Dark Matter by Rick Jacoski.
The hero of Rick Jacoski's debut novel at first seemed to be a misanthropic crank. James Dark, a retired English teacher, spent months wallowing in the cruel and idiotic ways of the world. Unfolded. If Dark depicted a painful journey into the light, Dark Matter charts forward steps and glances back at the abyss while exploring a predecessor and longer an urban hermit and has reconnected with Lucy. But he is still angry, jaded, and bereft, and reluctant. One day, he gives in to insistent knocking and finds 2 police officers outside. So he is wife's son. In his view, the terminally ill should in a cervic. The Procura set pieces include a poetry evening with a bunch of superannuated sofa-bound littérateurs. No. Wordiness, her loquacious spirit. But his heart is laid bare in his contemplation of the woman who still haunts him. It is good to have him back.
(17th, 2020). In the graphic details section, GDP and life satisfaction. Graphic detail. Can buy happiness and recession.
The most common gauge of national prosperity has taken a lot of flack in recent years. It say that counting a country's spend on good the G development, personal health is probably exaggerate GDP's failure to capture the wealth of nations. Gallup has asked people in 145 countries about various aspects of well-being. Many of these correlate strongly with GDP per person. To take an obvious example, nearly all residents in the top 10% of countries by spending say they have enough money for food compared with just 2/5 of those in the bottom 10%. Strikingly, many non-financial indicators also track GDP per person closely. Residents in the top 10% of countries score their life situation as 7 out of 10, compared with just 4 for those in the bottom 10%. They are also more likely to feel supported by their families, safe in their neighborhoods, and be trusting of their politicians, though they complain nearly as much as people in poor countries do about a lack of rest and
Science and technology. Climate change. Delayed cool. Emissions slashed today will be felt only in the middle of the century.
Much of the international effort thus far to combat climate change has focused on cutting emissions of greenhouse gases, chief among them carbon dioxide. That is, of course, a rational approach. Global average temperatures are roughly 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer today than in pre-industrial times, and CO2 is the main culprit. It and other greenhouse gases are produced when fossil fuels are burned to generate energy or power engines in steel and cement making by farming and deforestation. In the long term, eliminating these emissions is the only sustainable solution for stopping the inexorable warming of the planet. But greenhouse gas emissions do not cause an instantaneous rise in global temperatures, and neither does cutting them result in instantaneous cooling. Instead, it will take decades for today's policy efforts to result in measurable impacts on global temperature, as illustrated in a study published this week in Nature Communications. Using climate models, Bjorn Samset and his colleagues at Norway's Centre for International Climate Research probed hypothetical futures in which emissions of 9 different industrial pollutants, including carbon dioxide and methane, were either eliminated instantly or phased out at a rate of 5% each year, starting in 2020. In order to isolate their respective effects, each chemical was knocked out individually, while the rest were allowed to keep evolving as they would broadly if governments stuck to current climate pledges. Thus, the experiment tested how quickly additional efforts, as required by the Paris Agreement, would be seen in the rate of global warming. Running these simulations over and over again in order to get statistically reliable results suggests that cutting CO2 emissions could slow the rate of warming as early as 2033, but only if they are ended worldwide in 2020. In effect, that would mean eliminating 80% of the world's energy sources, including shutting down all fossil fuel power stations overnight, clearly not a realistic or desirable scenario. Reducing CO2 by 5% per year, starting this year, would produce a statistically significant deviation from what temperatures would have otherwise been only in 2044. And yet, even that rate of CO2 reduction is ambitious, on a par with the 4 to 7% drop estimated this year as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and widespread economic shutdowns. Before this, annual emissions were creeping up. Without concerted efforts from governments, they are likely to rise again as economies reopen. One reason for the delayed effect of slashing emissions is natural variability in the climate. Whether one year is warmer or cooler than the previous is not simply down to greenhouse gases. Large-scale natural climate effects also play a role. El Niño and La Niña are perhaps the best-known examples, warming and cooling the planet in a cyclical fashion by fractions of a degree. Depending on their phase, the warming of greenhouse gases is either masked or compounded by these kinds of natural effects. As emissions begin to drop, natural variability will also mask any slowdown of global warming that results. Dr. Samset's modelling took this into account. In addition, more than 90% of the energy trapped by the greenhouse gas emissions produced in the past half-century has been stored in the ocean and released to the atmosphere as heat only slowly. Even if all emissions were cut tomorrow, that process would continue to warm the air above for many years to come. The main reason for the delay, however, is that carbon dioxide emitted today will remain in the atmosphere to centuries before it is reabsorbed by vegetation and the oceans. That is not true of other industrial emissions. Each molecule of methane warms the planet 84 to 87 times more, averaged over 20 years, than carbon dioxide, but it stays aloft for merely years instead of decades or centuries. This has resulted in calls for immediate action to slash methane emissions, for instance, bugging leaks in natural gas infrastructure and reducing emissions from farming. But even then, Dr. Samset's work suggests that eliminating all sources of methane pollution in 2020 would not affect warming trends before 2039. Tragically, the pollutant that could have the most immediate impact is one that currently keeps the world cooler. Sulfur oxides are a byproduct of burning some fossil fuels, including coal and dirty bunker fuel, and are a target of policies to clean up maritime emissions and urban air pollution. In the atmosphere, they bounce a portion of solar radiation back out into space, producing a cooling effect. Because they are dragged back to Earth by rain within days of being emitted, cutting them out of industrial activities could boost warming by the end of the decade. In spite of all of this, mitigating emissions remains crucial to the stability of the global climate and the only way of meeting the Paris Agreement targets of limiting global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. But Dr. Samset argues that temperature may not be the best yardstick to measure the effectiveness of climate mitigation, at least not until the 2040s. Instead, direct measurements of the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere may be better, as they will remove the confounding effect of natural variability. And without clever messaging, there could be a public backlash against seemingly ineffectual policies. More fundamental, however, results like these underline that even as economies begin to decarbonize, governments and societies need to drastically step up efforts to adapt to the inevitable warming that lies ahead.
Books and arts. The Economist, July 11th to July 17th, 2020. In the Books and Arts section, Populism and Democracy, Party Like It's 1999, Japan Under the Shogunate, A Handmaid's Tale, Johnson, On Shock Value, and more.
Books and arts. Book review. Populism and Democracy. Party Like It's 1999. An insider recounts the collapse of the intellectual coalition that was forged by the Cold War.
For at least a decade after the end of the Cold War, anti-communist intellectuals rode the crest of a wave. The Soviet system had imploded, miraculously, but there was work, important, exhilarating work, to be done in eliminating its vestiges and uncovering its misdeeds. As an American-born chronicler of communism, Anne Applebaum surfed that wave with aplomb. She wrote incisive books about the Soviet penal system and the Western fools who failed to see its horrors, about Stalin's campaign after 1945 to crush democracy in half of Europe, and about the appalling famine he inflicted on Ukraine in the 1930s. In Twilight of Democracy, her tone is more personal and vulnerable. The informal transatlantic coalition of politicians, scholars, and writers to which she belonged has broken up, and the worst parts have, for now, come out on top. From Brexit Britain and Donald Trump's America to the cynical politics of Poland and Hungary, she feels beset by a new chauvinist right that has no regard for rules, truth, or institutions. Ms. Applebaum evokes an acute sense of betrayal as people she trusted turn against her quicker than she thought possible. Her personal story is a parable of what can happen to alliances in the absence of a common adversary, and when the hardships such enemies inflicted fade from memory. It has another implication too. As she shifts between ruminations over political science and anecdotes meant to expose the nastiness of the new political right, she sometimes brings home the complacency of her own tribe of liberal internationalists who thought that history, if not quite over, was bound to evolve benignly. The author, who in the late 1980s and early 1990s wrote for The Economist, is frank about herself. An insider with stratospheric links to the American and above all British commentariat, married to Radek Sikorski, a Pole who studied in Britain and hobnobbed with its gilded conservative youth, including Boris Johnson, now the Prime Minister. The book begins with an exuberant party, which the couple threw at their manor house in Poland in 1999, gathering in foreign and Polish friends for stew, liquor, and a few celebratory pistol shots. Since then, both have flown high, she as a prize-winning writer, he as Poland's defence and foreign minister. But in other ways, life has delivered shocks. She no longer speaks to many of the guests because they succumbed to the authoritarian temptations of the Law and Justice Party that has dominated Polish politics since 2015. They have thus adopted an outlook that sees imaginary enemies everywhere, plays on anti-immigrant and anti-gay sentiment, and has no respect for independent judges or media. Ms. Applebaum, a product of secular Jewish America, has been singled out for opprobrium. In various political case studies, she finds a style that assuages a yearning for simple answers. In Poland, a master narrative was provided by conspiracy theories about the plane crash in Russia in 2010 that killed President Lech Kaczynski. He recklessly insisted on landing in fog. In Hungary, the Jewish philanthropist George Soros has become a bogeyman, as Applebaum's erstwhile British friends see leaving the European Union as a panacea. Mr. Trump excoriates the liberal elite and even the moderate Republicans, who are Ms. Applebaum's natural allies. What interests her most is the phenomenon described by a French writer in 1927 as the treason of the intellectuals. The way many academics, editors, and leaders of civil society have been supine or collaborative in the face of populist authoritarianism. Her sharpest passages describe the milieu of British Tory journalism, in which she once sat at the top table in every sense. Few gain entry into this charmed circle only to break out of it. As deputy editor of The Spectator, a right-of-centre weekly, and co-host of its networking lunches, the author joined a scene where every conversation was laced with multi-layered irony, a baffling British subculture in which real feelings are carefully hidden. She reveres Margaret Thatcher's memory, but her account lays bare the inherent contradictions of Thatcherism, an appeal to preserve old mores and communities combined with economic change that wrecked them. Once the EU was identified as the enemy, she suggests the mawkish nostalgia felt by her former friends could let rip. But newcomers like her had no place in that fiercely sentimental world. In the United States and Hungary, her personal ties are weaker and her observations more abstract. But she mournfully anatomizes the breakdown of America's anti-communist coalition. She thought she was part of a moral crusade to spread constitutional principles and the rule of law. Now she realizes that there were other agendas at work. Some American conservatives were most concerned with spreading Christianity. For them, Vladimir Putin's Russia has, bizarrely, become an attractive alternative to the decadent West. Some saw the defense of America's narrow national interests from all comers, including immigrants, as paramount. Many never had that much interest in advancing democracy. This is too short a book to probe deeply into the roots of the conservative camp's embrace of coarse populism. In any case, though, Ms. Applebaum evinces relatively little interest in why ordinary voters are tempted by that option. She notes that neither economic hardship nor migration flows are correlated in any linear way with rightward political lurches. Hungarians, for instance, are obsessed with migrants who do not actually exist. But those factors are surely not irrelevant either. Elites, and would-be elites, concern Ms. Applebaum far more, and these she knows and describes well. Her approach is touchingly intimate. Twilight of Democracy ends with the onset of the pandemic, which forced her and one of her sons to race back to Poland before the borders closed. But her fine book would have been even better if there were clearer hints of self-awareness in her description of the liberal internationalist project. The effervescent mood of 1999 reflected not just a moral victory over Soviet darkness, but the apparently unchallenged might of the United States. Ronald Reagan and Thatcher had helped bring down communism. Bill Clinton and Tony Blair felt they could export liberal democracy everywhere. But even then, plenty of conservatives had doubts, including some of Ms. Applebaum's Tory friends, brought up as they were on Rudyard Kipling's imperial pessimism. Given the finitude of all human endeavours and of individual careers, that whole enterprise was always in danger of stalling as global power balances shifted. As a result, defending truth, Law and liberty has become a hard job for principled characters prepared to put friendships, livelihoods, and even lives on the line. Such people continue to exist, as Applebaum herself is one of them, albeit among the less imperiled. Meanwhile, pandemics permitting, she and her husband will still throw parties. The book features another shindig held 20 years after the first, but now the guest list is shorter.
Books and Arts. Book Review. Japan Under the Shogunate. A Handmaid's Tale. The reconstructed life of an obscure woman illuminates Japanese history. Stranger in the Shogun City by Amy Stanley.
In these times of self-isolation, it is worth remembering for more than 2.5 centuries, from 1603 to 1868, Japan cut itself off almost entirely from the outside world. The imperial line was cloistered in Kyoto, the capital, but real power was wielded by shoguns, or military chieftains, from the Tokugawa dynasty, whose seat was Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Their fear of Christianity induced them to shut the country's borders to most foreign traders. Their obsession with stability led to a strictly hierarchical class system. They suppressed internal dissent by demanding that every other year feudal lords leave their homelands and take up temporary residence near the shogun's palace in Edo. It was an era of stifling political orthodoxy. Yet at the same time, self-reliance led to a flowering of art, theatre, and craftsmanship. These traits still echo beneath the postmodern surface of Tokyo in the form of kabuki, noodle and eel bars, dolled-up hostesses, and manga comic books, which date back to the beautifully illustrated storybooks of the Edo era. Amy Stanley, an American historian, is enchanted by this faintly remembered world.